Welcome back to Outside Views, and today we're talking once more about a new kind of Iron Curtain descending across the English Channel. The EU's economic security strategy and the slow-motion isolation of British high-tech research. And my personal view is that while the world talks about global collaboration, the European Union is busy building a digital fortress, and the UK has just been left outside the gate with a notebook and no key. We are now in January 2026, and the outside view is that the EU's move toward technical sovereignty is effectively turning British scientists into security risks in the eyes of Brussels. And I believe that this reset promised by the Labour government is currently being crushed by a new reality where the EU treats its closest neighbour with the same regulatory suspicion as it does with a distant rival. And the primary weapon being used here is Article 22 of the Horizon Europe regulations, a clause that allows the EU to exclude associated countries, like the UK, from research projects deemed vital to European strategic autonomy. And my personal view is that this is a catastrophic betrayal of the scientific spirit, though, but driven by someone being really obsessed with sovereign compute, then it's with their actual innovation here. But still, I have full understanding for why this is happening. By the end of 2026, we expect to see British universities and tech startups barred from hundreds of high-value calls in quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. And I think it's a tragedy that the very people who built the foundation of modern computing are now being told they are too foreign to help build its future. But let's look at the first pillar of this exclusion, the European Quantum Act, which is scheduled to be formally proposed in the first half of 2026. My view is that this act is modeled more on a defense treaty than a scientific framework, specifically designed to ensure that the EU doesn't leak its quantum edge to third countries. The outside view is that even though the UK is back in Horizon Europe, the EU is increasingly using security-sensitive labels to ring-fence the most exciting programs for EU member entities only. Unfortunately, rightfully so. I believe that British experts in quantum encryption and sensing, many of whom are the best in the world, will find themselves legally prohibited from joining consortia in Paris, Munich or Delft. Internal documents from the European Commission suggest that for the 26-27 work program, any project involving critical dual-use quantum hardware will be strictly EU only. And my personal view is that this is a massive brain drain waiting to happen. If a British professor can't get the funding to work with their European peers, they will simply pack their bags and move to a university inside the bloc. And we're watching the systemic dismantling of a decades-old research ecosystem, all in the name of strategic autonomy. And we heard that from another side, but here we are talking about 27 member countries protecting their EU. It's not the EU. I know how it's always presented by the Brexiteers. I know how it was presented in the Leave campaign. But the EU is the 27 member countries, and the decisions are made by the 27 member countries, and they will protect their bloc. And the second pillar of this digital wall is the EU AI Act, which becomes fully applicable in August, creating a regulatory moat around the continent. And the EU is using its regulatory power to force a choice. Either you adopt the European way of AI governance, or you lose access to the European AI factories. And the outside view is that the UK's attempt to be a global AI hub is being undermined by the fact that British firms will have to spend millions just to prove their systems are compliant with Brussels standards, because they are a third country. And by late 2026, we expect the EU to launch its Apply AI strategy, which includes massive subsidies for trusted AI models, a status that British startups will find almost impossible to achieve. And I believe that the EU is effectively taxing British innovation by requiring technical documentation and risk assessments that are far more stringent than anything the UK government requires. And here's the catch. If a British company wants to participate in an EU-funded AI Excellence Centre, they may be required to hand over intellectual property or agree to data localization rules that effectively end their global independence. And I think it's incredibly ironic that the UK is investing £2 billion on its own compute roadmap, while the EU is writing rules that make it illegal for European firms to use that very compute power. And this brings us to the most significant mole of all, that's my term this week. The economic security doctrine, which is set to be enshrined in EU law by 2027. This doctrine will introduce a new economic security doctrine that outlines the strategic use of trade tools to prevent technology leakage. And my personal view is that the UK is being categorized as a leakage risk because of its close intelligence and tech ties with the United States. And the outside view is that Brussels doesn't trust the UK not to pass on European breakthroughs to the Pentagon or the Silicon Valley. And by early 2027, we expect to see export controls on knowledge, where a European researcher might need a government license just to share a specific line of code with a colleague in London. And I believe we are seeing the de-risking of the UK, where European companies are being quietly told to find more reliable partners within the single market to avoid future regulatory headaches. And the Commission's new Economic Security Information Hub will even monitor portfolio investments, meaning an EU venture capital fund might be discouraged from investing in a British quantum startup. I think the Starmer reset is failing to address this, because the government is still treating this as a trade problem when it's actually a geopolitical divorce. The political cost of this isolation is that Britain is becoming a technology taker in the very fields it should be leading. And as of late 2025, the UK has tried to fight back by creating its own AI growth zones, but my view is that these are just small islands in a rising sea of European protectionism. And if the UK isn't part of the €175 billion Horizon Europe successor starting in 2028, the gap between British and European research will become an unbridgeable chasm. And my personal view is that the British public is being sold a lie that you can collaborate from the outside when the EU has made it clear that the price of collaboration is submission. The outside view is that you can't have sovereignty in a world of giant tech blocks unless you are big enough to be a bloc yourself. And the UK simply isn't. And I believe that by 2027, the whack-a-mole game will have evolved into a locked-door reality, where the UK is a spectator in the most important technological revolution of our time. And it's a tragedy of their own making, delivered by a government that is too scared to admit that the special relationship with Europe is effectively dead. In conclusion, the EU's economic security standards are the final checkmate for the British tech sector's hopes and their hopes of a post-Brexit revival. We're looking at a future where your best scientists are barred from the biggest projects, your startups are priced out by compliance, and your research is treated as a security risk, just because you are not a member. And my personal view is that this is the logical endpoint of a Brexit that ignored the reality of how modern science and technology actually work. By the end of 2027, the UK will be a digital island separated from the continent by a wall of regulations that no amount of goodwill or resets can tear down. And the outside view is that the EU has chosen its path of strategic autonomy, and the path does not include a seat at the table for the United Kingdom as a third country. And I believe it's time for the British government to stop playing games and start telling the truth. You are being left behind, and the cost of your independence is your future. The whack-a-mole game is over. The moles have taken the hammer and they've used it to lock the door from the inside.